In this session, we'll be discussing how elders can shepherd their worship leaders and their worship team's hearts in a healthy and in a beautiful way. And just in leading up to this talk, Adam shared some beautiful thoughts out of Psalm 23. I would love just to pass the ball to him and kick off the session.
Yeah, it's not my original thoughts. I mean, this is something Andrew's often done with us as elders. He said, Psalm 23 is the Lord's my shepherd, but we're his under shepherds. And so as elders in the house, we need to look at Psalm 23 and say, do we reflect that to our people? And in this context, do we reflect that to our worship team? And so if we just look at something like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. As elders, do we provide what the worship team needs in terms of constructive feedback, in terms of support, opportunity, facilities, that kind of, just on a practical level, are we supplying what they need? He makes me lie down in green pastures. Does the stage or the band area in your church feel like green pastures? Or is it somewhere where angels fear to tread? Is it a place of nerves and frustration, or is it a place of love and gentleness? He leads me beside still waters. Is there something of the Spirit flowing from, not just the Spirit, but from the eldership to the worship team? That's something that he provides. He restores my soul. When there have been those moments of maybe conflict or disappointment in a worship situation, is the elder coming to restore the soul of that worship leader who feels defeated or broken by that experience? He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. There needs to be a discipling that happens from elders to worship team members. Often worship team members are musicians, and so they're these weird flaky people who have all kinds of emotions going on, and they're very erratic because they're artistic. And there needs to be a leading in paths of righteousness. There needs to be discipleship, and that's something the elders can do. Even walking through the valley of the shadow of death, hard situations, difficult times, to be there, that you won't fear evil. The worship team are not scared. And sometimes, I know it's over dramatic, but sometimes being on stage in front of a few hundred people feels like the valley of the shadow of death, and to know that your elders have got your back, that's a huge thing in that moment. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. When people are speaking ill of the worshippers and the worship team and saying, criticizing the bad song choice, bad music, are the elders jumping in on that and going, yeah, it was awful today? Or are they saying, hang on, these are guys that we've delegated a responsibility to, and I'm going to actually defend them. I'm going to protect them. And if there's things to correct, I'm going to correct it, but I'm going to do that with love. The rod and the staff are going to accompany, but there's going to be kindness in that, and an anointing of the head with oil. So that their cup overflows. Does the worship team feel like they're living with an overflowing cup, just bountiful sense of the Spirit and a wonderful sense of being supported and loved? So they can dwell in the house of the Lord forever, with goodness following them everywhere they go. So that's the gold standard. And I remember sitting in an elders meeting, and Andrew laid this out for us as elders. It was just like, okay, should we just stop, give up now? How do we practically deliver that, in a congregation? But let's unpack some of these ideas in terms of how elders can shepherd the worship team and really care for their hearts,
As elders, I find many times our default, and wisely so, is we recognize lack.
Right.
We recognize what's needed, and we see the crack that needs to be fixed.
Yes, yeah.
And it's so vital for us to train our hearts to see what can and needs to be celebrated too.
Yes.
Like any good father.
Yeah.
You need to know when you need to correct, and discipline, and add what's lacking, but then you need to know what can I celebrate, what's good, and what's beautiful. And I think holding that tension in working with worship team or with worship leaders is vital. That there would be times where you'd have to tweak something. There would be times where you have to address something or change something. But there needs to be that, I see the beauty. I can celebrate the good in you.
Yeah.
And that tension, for me, has brought health throughout the years. I don't think it's healthy to only go towards worship leader every week after week after week saying, you can do this better, 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 you can do that better, we can do this better. I think there has to be that relational thing of, hey man, I love it when you do that.
Yeah.
Or you're carrying something beautiful there.
Yeah.
Or I saw that you were bold and brave in that moment. You missed it, but it was beautiful, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I think often in a meeting setting, because this is where most of it actually plays out, one thing one needs to keep in mind is the interaction between the worship leader and the elder is actually very much in a public setting.
Yes.
So what happens there is actually very important, because to a certain extent it trains and it showcases something to the congregation.
Right.
The interaction that actually happens there. I've been in settings, leading worship. I've also been on the other side leading a meeting, being the elder leading a meeting, and have to communicate with a worship leader within that context. It's important to understand the tension in that moment.
Yeah.
Because on the one side, yes, you believe God is doing something. You want to be faithful to that. You want to steward the meeting into that direction. But on the other side, whether you're the elder or the worship leader, there's a person on the other side.
Yeah.
And as an elder, need to remember the worship leader, although there's maybe an unwise decision that's been made or something that is not, working very well, there's still a fathering, a shepherding responsibility within that meeting context. The meeting cannot be the end of it all.
Yeah.
Where in the end, the way that we communicate or the way that we correct can actually, either win or lose a heart.
Absolutely. I was years ago, I was a musician in the UK playing in a church. We had a conference setting with probably about 1,200 people in the room, and visiting American preacher came up, was preaching. He's clearly winding towards the point where he wants a response. He invited me to come up and play while he was preaching. At that time, I'm a young musician. My experience is classical and a little bit of rock and roll. He's clearly looking for something way more gospel, that kind of like that, Hammond organ or something. He's asking me to scroll through different sounds to get the sound he wants. I'm thinking, this is so strange. In the end, I just can't do what he wants. He turns to me and says, "Are you going to help me or hurt me?"
Yeah.
Is he in front of 1,200 people? I just don't know what to do. Like, I'm this mild English guy. I just sit there and just kind of go, oh. He goes, "Just sit there. Maybe I'll ask you later." I'm like, okay. This is like humiliating. You're sitting in front of the whole church, and at that moment you have a choice. I've got about 30 seconds to forgive this guy, or I'm not going to be able to carry on doing what I'm doing. Like, it's going to hurt me actually. But my response is also my responsibility. So there is a responsibility in the worshipper. But it was a wonderful end to the story, because as he continued preaching, there was a technical problem with his microphone. A crackling started coming through the system. He turned to accuse me of touching something, and the whole front row, which was like my home team, like the elders and apostles and guys, they're like, "It's not him." And he sort of turns back and was like, "Oh." And in that sense, I did feel the love. So this visiting guy, he didn't know me, he didn't have a relationship with me, he wasn't caring for me. He was a hireling. He ran when the sheep were attacked, he didn't care. But the shepherds in the house, they were like, "It's not him, you don't treat him that way." And I felt so comforted in that moment, like I'd really been looked after.
Yeah.
I think that's so key. Like often, as elders, we're called to be the shepherds. Sometimes we can be the cause of the hurt that happens. We can be the cause of the disappointment or the cracks that start to appear. We need to be so careful with our speech towards those who are serving. Most of them, they're volunteers. They come, they give their time, they give their talents, and they bring their own instruments. They've invested money, they've invested time. They're wanting to serve Jesus. They're probably doing their best. And so we need to come as elders with an appropriate response to that offering that honours the person while tweaking what needs to be tweaked. You know,
I actually remember the first time I led worship or had the responsibility of leading, and there was no one else. They asked me to lead that morning. And as soon as I started, I realized I'm completely missing this. It's just not going the way it needs to go. You look at the congregation and no one is actually engaging. You're actually not even sure what to do next.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I looked at the lead elder standing in front of me, and his eyes were closed, and he was worshiping.
Right.
And it had such an impact on me, knowingly that I was probably I'm disappointing a couple of people here.
Yeah.
Looking at that, it created so much faith in my heart. And afterwards, he did debrief with me. He spoke to me, but there was a trust between the two of us. I just knew he got my back.
I love that. You spoke about Psalm 23. It leads me to green pastures. At the stage, it should be a green pasture.
Yeah.
It should be a safe place because our value, our culture is family.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't be afraid for our worship guys, our worship teams to make mistakes.
Yeah.
It's part of the whole thing. I've realized that it's an exposed place. When you're on that stage, you are exposed. You feel exposed at least. You've got all these eyes on you. You're singing flat and sharp. The songs aren't working where it is, whatever the case may be. I think it's so vital that when your worship leader relates to you on a Sunday, that they don't see frustration.
Yes.
They see faith. They see celebration. They see worship. Yeah. Because we're now touching that thing. That worship team is not leading people into the presence of God.
No.
It's the blood of Jesus that brings us into the presence of God. And even going further than that, the culture of worship is not dependent on the worship team.
Yeah.
It's us as elders, right?
Yeah.
We are stewarding the culture of worship within our specific household. So that's a vital thing for me, because they will leak confidence if they see frustration. Yeah. If they don't see I'm behind you, celebration. And the stronger you build that bridge, obviously, when you have to tweak and debrief and say, you guys could have done this better. I think all our worship guys are open for that. We want those conversations. We want to learn. We want to grow. But within an environment where we feel like we're celebrated, we're loved, we have the gift of trust from you. Yeah. You trust us with this. Yeah. And in partnering with our worship leaders that way, I think that's when it really becomes beautiful and the gift that they are to us shines fully. Yeah. And brightly when that is the environment, when there's no fear of failure. Yeah. You right?
Yeah, I think in all these things, there's going to be that exception. We were in a meeting recently where the worship team had prepared, they felt like they had a good plan, and the worship began, and it was fairly apparent from early on, this isn't it. And at a certain point, Andrew stood up and said, actually, let's just stop. And he made an effort to say, look, it's not them, and I like them, and I like their worship leading normally, but this just doesn't feel like the thing that we're meant to be doing right now. And he brought that correction. Now, in those moments, it's very hard to bring such a strong correction and it not be in some ways jarring or upsetting for the team that's involved. I don't know if you can ever avoid that. But the thing is, if you've built a culture where every other time you didn't do that.
Absolutely.
If you built a culture where every other time you've loved and affirmed and supported your musicians, then the one time you actually do have to correct, it works out fine. And I think the challenge there is, if as elders, I think one of you said it already, if we're always critical and never supportive. I mean, we talk a lot about the love sandwich, like, here's something you did well, here's something we can do better, but we do love you and you're fantastic and awesome. And, in some ways, once you know you're getting a love sandwich, you're just waiting for the meat in the middle. But it is still nice to hear the bread, to know that you're loved and affirmed and valued.
I think as elders, it's very helpful to lead skillfully. Yeah. And we need to help, and we can help our worship leaders in those moments where we feel it's difficult. Yeah. There's either, feel like you're dragging a horse up a hill. Right. We can come alongside instead of only looking towards they're not leading well, or the songs isn't working, or so many times I advise elders, if you feel like the congregation isn't singing along that well, I'm just using this as an example, take the mic, support the worship team by saying, guys, let's sing the chorus louder, let's seek the face of the Lord, just help guys with that. Another thing that I found helpful for in leading a meeting, in helping the worship team, is I always use the analogy of a stream becoming a river.
Right.
So when a worship meeting starts, most of the time, there are the exceptions, but most of the time, I love the picture of a stream swelling in size.
Yeah.
But if you put too many obstacles in at the beginning, if it's a very skillful worship leader, he'll find his way. But if you put too many obstacles in the beginning, and you don't allow this river to swell in size slightly, worship will, not always, but it will be much more beneficial to just give some space for the volume to swell. Because once it reaches a certain volume, you can throw in as many rocks. The river is flowing and the river is moving.
And I mean, practically there, you're talking like when we release the prophetic, or someone has a song from the congregation, or things that might break into the flow of worship and cause us to it feels like a handbrake sometimes until that river really is in flood, and then there's no obstacle.
I'm thinking of the way Josh Jen is planting out quickly at the moment.
Right.
And so that means you get the guy that lifts his hand to lead worship. And he's got to grow in skill, he's got to grow in confidence. And he's a young worship leader with a guitar. Suddenly he's never done it, he's got to do it now. He's the guy. And it's really these kinds of things, because we are church planting culture, these are the kinds of things that really helps worship leaders. When you set them up for success rather than failure, they will grow in confidence, and as they grow in confidence, even the tweaks then are received better.
I know I was in a meeting recently where the elder leading the meeting started by saying, we're going to have a moment just of being silent before the Lord. He took a minute or two, and everyone was silent, and directly after that he took the mic and said, now we're going to praise God with a praise song. And he passed it to a worship leader, which you could see was fairly new in this. He started with a praise song, and people were definitely not gathering.
Right.
It had the opposite effect. That for me, for example, was a good example of an elder actually not leading skillfully, or actually setting up that worship leader well. It's a new worship leader. You can see he still needs to grow in confidence. What would be helpful beforehand was even just reading a psalm or giving one or two handles to the congregation, encouragement to climb in behind this worship leader, to follow him well, to sing together. And what happened, the result of that was they stopped the worship almost directly after the first song with prophetic words and certain direction that also just worked against this new worship leader. So if it was actually set up well from the beginning, that most probably would have not happened. So how we lead as elders are actually very, very, very important for a worship leader.
Just a couple of thoughts, and we'll land the conversation. One of the things I've seen elders do in wanting to save a moment, instead of having faith for the moment. Before you engage as an elder in a worship set because of frustration, I think it's wonderful to get into the habit of finding faithful moments versus we've got to now sing the right song. And maybe it does need the right song. But having that environment where I'm finding faith for this, because it's a vital and crucial thing. What not to do, in my opinion, go on stage browsing through songs. No matter how well you've built that bridge, that worship leader, that worship team is now leaking confidence. Because what you're saying to them is, I'm not trusting your preparation. I'm looking for something that you're not bringing, etc., etc. It helps even beforehand to just have a conversation with, or tell the worship leader, come to me, or you go to, or however, have a conversation. What are the songs? So you know what you're working with, so that you can lead better from the front. I find that helpful because that stage is exposed, right?
Yeah.
So this was helpful. I think we can probably talk another 2-3 hours about shepherd. I mean, there's hundreds of things we can talk about. I hope thank you for your angles, and I hope this was helpful to you guys. Again, what to take from this is, I think, more importantly than the skill of leading a meeting and all these things, is you're working with a heart. You're working with a son, you're working with a daughter, you're working with a heart. Shepherd them well and love them. They are gifts. They're bringing what they have, and their heart is to honor and to serve.